I am usually a big fan of coming to things like this with, as you can see, prepared remarks, but the problem with that, most of the time, is that these guys are running the show, and every single time I show up to do one of these things, everything has changed. And right now, of course, we're dealing with the bombing in Baghdad of the UN building. So we might as well just get a little bit caught up on that really quickly. I'm sure all of you are aware what happened. The ramifications of this are, well, it's interesting. Yesterday they were disturbing. Now they're kind of confusing and maddening. Yesterday I was worried that whoever it is that pulled that particular trick off knows exactly what they're doing, because we are not going to extract ourselves from this thing unless this conflict can get internationalized. Bring the international community in, bring the UN in, get the humanitarian groups in there, and get the U.S. troops out. There are some people who believe that we should just get up and get out, but I think that would be something of a catastrophe. That would be akin to what we did in Afghanistan in 1989, and there's a great big hole in the ground in New York to testify to what happens when we do something like that. The bombing of the UN building, I was worried yesterday, signified, I thought, the fact that the UN wasn't going to want to have anything to do with this. The humanitarian groups weren't going to have anything to do with this. Whoever it is that is bombing this stuff is targeting infrastructure, targeting, there was an oil line, there was a water line, and now there's the UN building, making it very difficult for anybody, much less the United States, to get things under control over there, which is basically whoever it is that pulled this thing off is trying to do to us what we did to the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, making it impossible to get out, making it a quagmire, and that would be a catastrophe. But today, apparently Mr. Negroponte and Mr. Powell started browbeating the United Nations to pass a Security Council resolution and get in and get over there. Now, nominally, I would say that's a good thing, except that the administration is practicing its typical bulldozer diplomacy in Iraq and demanding that everybody come in and do this, but they do it our way. The UN is saying, democratize your process. No, you do it our way. Democratize your process. So God only knows where this is going to go. It's going to become a fairly big mess. One interesting thing that came out of this today was that the UN pretty much pointedly said today that the Iraqi assembly that the administration and Bremer have put together, the UN pretty much came out and pointedly said that the group is entirely illegitimate and not representative of the people. And they won't have anything to do with it. So, for a brief shining moment, I thought that we were going to be in a position where we could actually begin the process of getting our troops out and getting humanitarian UN troops in there, but given the incredible penchant this administration has for screwing up even the easiest of things, I don't know where that's going to lead. So that's where we are. And most of where we are right now, I would say, has to do with a rather demented set of priorities and values. I remember specifically October 4th, 2001. There was a pall of smoke and ash still hanging over New York City in the aftermath of September 11th. And Mr. Bush said on October 4th, 2001, quote, "We need to counter the shockwave of the evildoer by having individual rate cuts accelerated and by thinking about tax rebates." That's moral. Use the horror of September 11th to push your harebrained no taxes for rich people scheme. That's the best thing that we could possibly do at this point. It's indicative of how much September 11th was the best thing that ever happened to this administration and to George Bush personally. They have used it for everything, including scaring the hell out of all of you and scaring the American people into a war that did not need to happen. Another example happened a little bit more recently. I don't know if you're aware of an executive order that was passed on May 22nd called Protecting the Development Fund for Iraq and Certain Other Property in which Iraq has an Interest. Let's be clear on one thing. The so-called Development Fund for Iraq is, in fact, one of the most grandiose money laundering schemes in the history of the world. All of the profits made from plundering Iraq's oil go into this, ostensibly for the Iraqi people. Actually, this is the platform, the clearinghouse for payouts to Halliburton and Kellogg Brown and Root. Bear that in mind. The May 22 executive order reads, I, George W. Bush, President of the United States of America, find that the threat of attachment or other judicial process against the Development Fund for Iraq, Iraqi petroleum and petroleum products, and interests therein, and proceeds, obligations, or any financial instruments of any nature whatsoever arising from or related to the sale or marketing thereof, and interest therein, obstructs the orderly reconstruction of Iraq, the restoration and maintenance of peace and security in the country, and the development of political, administrative, and economic institutions in Iraq. This situation constitutes an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States, and I hereby declare a national emergency to deal with that threat. I hereby order, unless licensed or otherwise authorized pursuant to this order, any attachment, judgment, decree, lien, execution, garnishment, or other judicial process is prohibited and shall be deemed null and void. Now you can be sure of two things. Number one, George didn't write any of that. Number two, this executive order gives complete and total legal cover to Halliburton to do whatever they want in Iraq. No one can sue them. No one can touch them. They have been removed by executive order from civilization and the rule of law with a stroke of George's pen. Bush did not declare a national emergency over the fact that the Iraqi people have no electricity, no running water, no functioning hospitals, garbage in the streets, and that they are dying by the day from deprivation and basically from the war. He did not declare a national emergency because between 1 and 5 American soldiers are getting their brains blown out over there every day. We lost another one today. He did not declare a national emergency because a bunch of humanitarian workers at the UN building just got blown sideways out of their offices. He declared a national emergency to nail down the oil. Period. George W. Bush may have signed that order, but I think we can probably all agree that George is not running things around here. Blaming George W. Bush for the gross misadministration of this government is like blaming Mickey Mouse when Disney screws up. He is not in charge. Truman once said, the buck stops here. And so we point to Bush as a symbol of everything that has gone wrong. But if we are going to be accurate, we must look at the people who are really running things, the real movers and shakers. I'm talking about Dick Cheney, Don Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, Louis Scooter Libby, John Bolton, and the rest of these clowns from the Project for the New American Century. Make no mistake, Dick Cheney is the President of the United States. And that should scare the hell out of you. So there are our priorities. Let's talk a little bit about lies. I assume that you all have heard of the Office of Special Plans. Those of you who haven't, let me introduce you. This is a little bit detail-oriented, so bear with me. You all have heard, I assume, of Joseph Wilson? He was just here. Greg Thielman is another one, guy you should be paying attention to. I'm going to introduce you to somebody else. The Office of Special Plans, or OSP, was created by Secretary of Rumsfeld specifically to second-guess and reinterpret intelligence data pertaining to Iraq's weapons of mass destruction and connections to al-Qaeda. The OSP was staffed by rank amateurs, rank intelligence amateurs who were only chosen because their ideological pedigree suited Mr. Rumsfeld. This group was on no government payroll and endured no congressional oversight. But their information and interpretations managed to prevail over the data being provided by the State Department and the CIA. This group was able to accomplish this incredible feat because their number one patron was Vice President Dick Cheney. The highest level of OSP were staffed by heavy hitters, and these are names to remember: Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Douglas J. Feith, and William Luty, a former Navy officer who worked for Cheney before joining the Pentagon. These two men, along with their civilian advisors, worked according to a strategy that they hoped would recreate Iraq into an Israeli ally, destroy a potential threat to Persian Gulf oil trade, and wrap U.S. allies around Iran. The State Department and the CIA saw their planning for this and the intelligence that they were talking about as being badly flawed. In response, The gentlemen at the Office of Special Plans cut state and CIA completely out of the loop. And they were able to do this because they had Mr. Cheney on their side. When the OSP wanted to change or exaggerate evidence of Iraqi weapons and capabilities, they sent Mr. Cheney down to CIA headquarters on 3 separate unprecedented trips where he browbeat the analysts for forward-leaning intelligence estimates. When Mr. Cheney was unable to go, Scooter Libby went. On 3 occasions, former Congressman Newt Gingrich visited CIA in his capacity as a consultant for the ultra-conservative Defense Policy Board once chaired by Mr. Richard Pearl. According to these accounts of these visits, Gingrich also browbeat the analysts to toughen up their assessments of the dangers posed by Hussein. He was allowed access to the CIA and the analysts because he was a known emissary for the Office of Special Plans. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Karen Kwiatkowski. Let me say that name again. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Karen Kwiatkowski worked in the Office of Special Plans with Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Douglas Feith until her retirement this past April. Quote, "What I saw was aberrant, pervasive, and contrary to good order and discipline," Kwiatkowski wrote recently. "If one is seeking the answers to why particular bits of intelligence found sanctity in a presidential speech, or why the post-Saddam occupation has been distinguished by confusion and false steps, one need look no further than the process inside the Office of the Secretary of Defense." Kwiatkowski went on to charge that the operations she witnessed during her tenure in Feith's office, and particularly of those of the Office of Special Plans, constituted, quote, "a subversion of constitutional limits on executive power and a co-optation through deceit of a large section of Congress." Kwiatkowski's charges, which confirm reports offered to the press by retired officers from other intelligence agencies and their still active but anonymous former colleagues, are likely to make her a prime witness when Congress reconvenes in September to discuss these very matters. Lieutenant Colonel Karen Kwiatkowski. According to Kwiatkowski, the same operation that allegedly cooked the intelligence also was responsible for the administration's failure to anticipate the problems that now dog the U.S.'s occupation of Iraq, or, in her more colorful words, that have placed 150,000 U.S. troops in, quote, "the world's nastiest rat's nest," without a nation-building plan, without significant international support, and without an exit plan. Now, had I been there, I probably could have told her that they don't have an exit plan because they don't want an exit plan. And we'll get to that in a minute. Kwiatkowski's comments bring memories of those who worked from the National Security Council back in the 1980s in an operation that became known as the Iran-Contra scandal, which is interesting in and of itself. Iran-Contra alumnus and close Pearl associate Michael Ledeen has renewed ties with his old acquaintance, Manicur Ghorbanifar. Anybody remember that name? An Iranian arms merchant who became the key link between the National Security Council's Oliver North, the operations head of Iran-Contra, and the so-called moderates in the Islamic Republic. But to what end? It appears that certain elements in the Pentagon's leadership, specifically Douglas Feith and his Office of Special Plans, are trying to sabotage sensitive talks between Tehran and the State Department to promote cooperation over al-Qaeda and other pressing issues affecting Afghanistan and Iraq. In other words, they want a war. The Pentagon clique thinks Ledeen's old friend Ghorbanifar can help, according to Newsday, which reported that 2 of Feith's senior aides, without notice to the other agencies, have held several meetings with the Iranian, whom the CIA has long considered, quote, "an intelligence fabricator and a nuisance." Sort of like Ahmed Chalabi. Newsday's disclosure that Feith's office has been used for secret contacts with Ghorbanifar suggests that the work of this small group of officials goes well beyond assessing intelligence and making policy recommendations. There's a surprise. According to Karen Kwiatkowski, the political appointees assigned there and their contacts at State, the National Security Council, and Cheney's office tended to work as a network. Feith's office often deliberately cut out, ignored, or circumvented normal channels of communication both within the Pentagon and with other agencies. Quote, "I personally witnessed several cases of staff officers being told not to contact their counterparts at State or the NSC because that particular decision would be processed through a different channel," wrote Kwiatkowski. In one interview, she insists that her views of Feith's appointees and operations were widely shared by other professional staff. Quoting one veteran career officer who was, quote, "in a position to know what he was talking about," Kwiatkowski says, "What these people are doing now makes Iran-Contra look like amateur hour." The OSP, quote, from Representative David Obey, a senior Democrat in the House of Representatives, was charged with collecting, vetting, disseminating intelligence completely outside the normal intelligence apparatus. In fact, it appears that the information collected by this office was in some instances not even shared with the established intelligence agencies, and in numerous instances was passed on to the National Security Council and the President without having been vetted with anyone other than the Secretary of Defense. Kind of shed some interesting light on that whole blaming the CIA for the Niger uranium weapons of mass destruction they can't find thing, huh? Let's review a little bit of that because I think it's important. The story seems to have drifted out of the mainstream media's attention, and it probably will serve us to remind ourselves what all that was about. A few weeks ago, on a Friday to be exact, CIA Director Tenet publicly jumped on the Niger evidence hand grenade, claiming that the use in Bush's State of the Union address in January of 2003 of data from known forgeries to support that the Iraq War was completely his fault. He never told Bush's people that the data was corrupted, and it was his fault those, quote, 16 words regarding Iraq's attempt to procure uranium from Niger for a nuclear program made it into the text of the speech. Niger recently asked for an apology, by the way. Problem solved, right? Condoleezza Rice and Don Rumsfeld had been triangulating on Tenet since that Thursday on the talk shows, claiming the CIA had never informed the White House about the dubious nature of the Niger evidence. Tenet, like a good political appointee, fell on his sword and took the responsibility for the error. And on that Saturday, White House spokesman Ari Fleischer said in a press conference that Bush had, quote, moved on from the controversy. Not so fast, said the New York Times editorial board. The paper of record for the Western world published an editorial on that Saturday entitled The Uranium Fiction. The last time the Times editors used language this strong was when Bush, in a moment of seemingly deranged hubris, nominated Henry Kissinger to chair the September 11th investigation. Quote from the New York Times editorial. It is clear, however, that much more went into the affair than the failure of the CIA to pounce on the offending 16 words in Mr. Bush's speech. A good deal of information already points to a willful effort by the war camp of the administration to pump up an accusation that seemed shaky from the outset and that was pretty well discredited long before Mr. Bush stepped into the well of the House of Representatives last January. Doubts about the accusation were raised in March 2002 by Joseph Wilson, a former American diplomat, after he was dispatched to Niger to look into the issue. Mr. Wilson said he is confident that his concerns were circulated not only within the agency, but at the State Department and the Office of Vice President Dick Cheney. Mr. Tenet, in his statement yesterday, confirmed that the Wilson finding had been given wide distribution, although he reported that Mr. Bush, Mr. Cheney, and other officials had not been directly informed about it by the CIA. Convenient. The sun came up that Saturday to shine on copies of the Washington Post sitting on doorsteps waiting for people to read them. The front page story was titled, CIA Got Uranium Reference Cut in October. And let me stop right there and tell you something. I've been very frustrated with the Washington Post lately. The editorial board seems to have completely lost its mind. But if you see a Washington Post article written by a man named Walter Pincus, read it. Walter Pincus has been the CIA's voice within the Washington Post since the Iran-Contra scandal. When the CIA wants to get something out, Walter Pincus is who they use. And now that the CIA is trying to get scapegoated by the Bush administration, they are using Walter Pincus to get out their side of the story. Everything we know about what really happened, as opposed to what the administration claims happened, has come from the pen of Walter Pincus. So if you see his name, read it. This story, CIA Got Uranium Reference Cut in October, came 2 days after Mr. Tenet took the blame for the 16 words, saying the administration had not been informed, he never told them, nobody told them, they were completely out of the loop about the uranium thing. Quote, CIA Director George J. Tenet successfully intervened with White House officials to have a reference to Iraq seeking uranium from Niger removed from a presidential speech last October, 3 months before a less specific reference to the same intelligence appeared in the State of the Union address. Tenet argued personally to White House officials, including the Deputy National Security Advisor Stephen Hadley, that the allegation should not be used. What do we have here? Here is CIA Director Tenet arguing in October of 2002 against the use of the Niger evidence, stating bluntly that it was useless. He made this pitch directly to the White House. These concerns were brushed aside by Bush officials, and the forged evidence was used, despite these warnings, in the State of the Union address. Now, the administration is trying to claim that they were never told the evidence was bad. Yet between Tenet's personal appeals in the October of 2002, Ambassador Wilson's assurances that everyone who needed to know was in the know regarding Niger, and the data that has come out and will continue to come out about the Office of Special Plans, it appears that the administration has been caught red-handed in a series of incredible falsehoods. What a surprise. Andrew Wilkie, a former senior intelligence analyst for the Office of National Assessments, which is basically the Australian CIA, spoke to me on the Sunday that all of this was breaking loose. He crystallized the issue at hand by stating, quote, "Remember that the sourcing of uranium from Niger was the only remaining pillar in the argument that Iraq was trying to reconstitute its nuclear weapons program. By this stage, the aluminum tube story had been laughed out of the room. That had been laughable in 2001, leaving the sourcing of uranium as the last key piece of evidence about Iraq reconstructing a nuclear program. It's not just 16 words. It was worth a hell of a lot more than 16 words. I can remember that October speech by Bush where he talked about mushroom clouds, by the way, 3 sentences after evoking the horror of September 11th. The nuclear story was played up as the most emotive and persuasive theme. It was not just 16 words. It was not just 16 words. There's a page on the White House's own website, whitehouse.gov, that describes the administration's central argument for war in Iraq. You can look it up. The page is called Disarming Saddam Hussein. The Niger evidence is still featured prominently, along with claims that Iraq was in possession of 26,000 liters of anthrax, 38,000 liters of botulinum toxin, 500 tons of sarin, mustard, and VX nerve agents. 500 tons, for those of you without your calculators, is 1 million pounds. Hide that for me, would you? 30,000 munitions capable of delivering chemical agents, and several mobile biological weapons labs. The Niger evidence has been destroyed, so much so that we are the laughingstock of the world. And the mobile weapons labs, termed Winnebagos of Death by Colin Powell, he said that in public, at the UN, have been proven to be weather balloon launching platforms sold to Iraq by the British in the 1980s. The vast quantities of anthrax, botulinum toxin, sarin, mustard gas, and VX, along with the munitions to deliver them, as well as any connections between Iraq and al-Qaeda, have completely failed to show up. And that, to me, is the most damning thing. They used September 11th against us. And if there was ever an impeachable offense, that's it. Now, of all the lies this administration has told in its 2.5 years of running the joint, these ones surrounding the Iraq weapons, the al-Qaeda connections, and all the rest of it are the bloodiest, obviously, but kind of also the most confounding. Why would they do this? Didn't they know that they were going to get caught? I mean, this has been unraveling for weeks, and some would say for months. Hell, I got a book on a table over here that I published a year ago talking about this stuff. Didn't they know they'd get caught? Why would they take the risk? Well, have you ever heard of a company called United Defense out of Arlington, Virginia? Let me introduce you, if you are not aware. United Defense provides combat vehicle systems, fire support, combat support vehicle systems, weapons delivery systems, amphibious assault vehicles, and combat support services. Some of United Defense's current projects include the Bradley family of fighting vehicles, the M113 family of fighting vehicles, the M88A2 recovery vehicle, the Grizzly, the M9 Ace, the composite armored vehicle, the M6 linebacker, the M4 command and control vehicle, the battle command and control vehicle, the Paladin, the Future Scout and Cavalry System, the Crusader, electric gun technology, pulse power technology, advanced simulations and training systems, and fleet management. This list goes on and on. Who owns United Defense? The Carlyle Group owns United Defense. For those of you who are not aware, I'm sure there are very few of you who are not, the Carlyle Group is a private global investment firm. Carlyle is the 11th largest defense contractor in the United States because of its ownership of companies making tanks, aircraft wings, and other equipment. Carlyle has ownership stakes in 164 companies, which generated $16 billion in revenue in the year 2000 alone. The Carlyle Group does not provide investment or other services to the general public. Who works for the Carlyle Group? George Herbert Walker Bush has been a senior consultant for the Carlyle Group for years and sits on the board of directors. This company is profiting wildly from this war, a tidy gift from son to father. And then, of course, there is Dick Cheney's Halliburton, profiting in the millions and soon to be the billions from work that was not bid to anybody else, but the company that is still giving Dick Cheney a $1 million annual payment, what they call a deferred retirement benefit. In Boston, we call that a paycheck. So we have a company that is umbilically connected to George W. Bush, reaping billions in profit from the war, and another company that is umbilically connected to Dick Cheney, being Halliburton, reaping similarly vast profits, while under the full legal protection of George W. Bush and that executive order. And I might also mention that the subsidiary of Halliburton, being Kellogg Brown and Root, their stock and trade is the building of permanent military bases. So much for the exit plan. Meanwhile, this administration is pointedly attempting to reverse the results of the 1932 presidential election by systematically destroying any ability the federal government has to support programs like Social Security, Medicare, and public schooling, thus opening the door for the eventual privatization of everything and everything and everything else. Our recent blackout party in the East Coast tells you all you need to know about what happens when privatization and deregulation walks hand in hand with the administration. The top two executives of First Energy Corporation, the Ohio-based utility that is a focus of investigations into the blackouts, are key financial supporters of Mr. Bush, according to campaign records. H. Peter Berg, chairman and chief executive of First Energy, was one of three hosts of a $600,000 fundraiser for Bush's re-election campaign in Akron, Ohio. Vice President Cheney was the featured speaker. Anthony J. Alexander, First Energy's president and chief operating officer, was a pioneer for Bush's latest campaign, meaning he raised at least $100,000. Alexander also contributed $100,000 to Bush's inaugural committee. Enron, excuse me. I remember Enron. So everybody's out to make a buck, right? Some would say that the payout on this is enough justification for these people to float the astounding lies that they have floated. Others would say that the ideological desires of the men actually running the White House, desires that include massively augmenting our war-making ability so that we can take Iraq and the rest of the Middle East and westernize it, bringing our values to them at the point of the sword, are enough. All these men in the administration are adherents or signatories of a group called the Project for a New American Century, which has been agitating on these ideological grounds for war and takeover in Iraq since at least 1997, some would say for 20 years. Author Norman Podhoretz, one project man, described the effort as, quote, the modernization and reformation of Islam. That's a pretty fancy phrase. I'm a Catholic, so I'm just going to call it a crusade. We know all about those. But still, is it enough? Is all of this enough? The money, the ideology, all the rest of it, is this enough to take such a fantastic risk for these lies? Why else would they take the chance? Was it perhaps to distract us from something else? Something that, if brought to light, would annihilate this White House? September 11th, perhaps? Think about it, especially in the context of what we've recently been hearing. Two major sections of the report on September 11th have been deleted and classified by the White House. One deals with allegations that Saudi Arabia played a role in attack, and that's been the one that's getting all the press. The other one details all the different times George W. Bush was warned that something fantastic was on the way. Egypt, Germany, Israel, Russia. Vladimir Putin personally and pointedly warned Mr. Bush that something very big was coming down the pike. Mr. Tenet, you want to know why George Tenet still has a job? Because on August 6, 2001, he sat down and personally delivered a intelligence briefing to George W. Bush entitled, Osama bin Laden intends to attack the United States, and the word hijacking was in that report. And what did George do? Did he call the National Security Council together and say, okay, fellas, we got to do something about this? Did he order heightened security at the airlines? He went to Texas and chopped wood for a month. So if you want to know why George Tenet still has his job, is because he is unfireable. Because right now, he knows a lot more than he's saying, and the deleted sections of these reports, of this report, tells us a lot more than we're currently hearing. Add these things together: the Saudi connections, the warnings, the profiteering, the business connections on all sides, and you have a damn good reason to start a war to cover your ass. I could keep you here all night talking about this stuff. But I've been all over the place in the last couple of months. I think I've put about 20,000 miles on these boots since the middle of July, talking to people just like you about stuff just like this. And one of the things that keeps coming back over and over and over again from a lot of people, and I don't know if you share this, but a lot of people are feeling very overwhelmed. They're feeling like, what the hell am I doing even thinking I can take a hack at this? I'd say right off the bat about the folks that came up here and talked about these different alternative community media things that they're offering for you to go do. If you're sitting here thinking there's no way that I could do that, I'm a school teacher, okay? I just started doing this because somebody had to do it. If I can do it, you can do it. But I know a lot of people. But I know that there are a lot of people who are really feeling the way they did when the shock and awe came down. Despair, just beaten up. How is this possible that I'm going to do anything about this? And I have just a quick story to tell you that kind of reaffirms why it is that I am able to keep doing this despite what seem to be pretty long odds. Frankly, I don't think they're as long as people say. I don't believe what the television tells me, okay? You shouldn't either. One of my earliest memories of childhood is sitting in front of the television watching a baseball game with my mother in our little apartment outside Boston. It was 1975, and the Red Sox were playing the Reds in what became one of the greatest World Series ever played. The Reds were winning the game that we were watching at the time, and I looked up at my mom and said, I'm going to root for the Reds. And she said, you can't do that. The Red Sox are your team. And even though, I mean, at that point, I'm tiny, but I could still smell the aura of doom. I know I'm in Seattle, so I'm preaching to the choir here. The Red Sox are your team. It is wrong to bail out on them because they're losing. You stay with your team no matter what. Besides, one of these days they're going to win this thing. And you will feel pretty stupid if you bailed out on them before that happened. So I've been a Red Sox fan ever since. I remember Bucky Dent the way some people remember Sirhan Sirhan. I was watching the World Series in a basement in Newton in 1986 when that ball skipped nimbly through Bill Buckner's legs. And my friend Andrew, who was with me at the time, the basement ceiling was about this tall, about this high, was so outraged that he stood up and punched the ceiling so hard that he dented the linoleum in the kitchen upstairs. I just sat there with the plaster dust in my hair, numb, with this sinking feeling in my gut. And later that night, we were walking back from the store when we were accosted by this just abysmally inebriated Red Sox fan whose universe had once again been destroyed. He made us do push-ups on the greasy blacktop of a gas station to offer up some sort of atonement to a universe that had reached out once again to crush him. He was huge, we were small, and as I pushed up and down off of that oil-soaked pavement, I thought that somehow it all made sense. In George W. Bush's America, being even moderately liberal is like being a Red Sox fan. You know what needs to happen, you know what's right, and some cosmic force akin to the shade of Babe Ruth always manages to come down and crush you right at the moment when you're about to achieve something good and great, like, for example, the 2000 election. If you do manage to get your lineup together, home run issues, grand slam arguments, all-star players, which we have a few of right now, you will get completely outspent by the damn Yankees, who are sitting in your division with more money than God and the will to use it. Politics, like baseball, has no spending limits. And then, of course, there are the umpires. I remember with painful specificity a game in the 1999 American League Championship Series between the Red Sox and the Yankees. Red Sox players running like hell for second base, and Chuck Knobloch swings a tag at him that missed by this much. The umpire called him out. And no amount of dirt kicking and screaming and yelling could reverse that call. The Red Sox wound up losing the series, and the Yankees went on to win their 2 millionth World Series. Knobloch sucks. He hit Keith Olbermann's mother with a baseball. This ESPN announcer, one of those wild throws that he threw from second to first, went up into the audience and beamed main ESPN announcer's mother right in the head. It was poetry. In George W. Bush's America, the umpires sit in front of television cameras and work for major news networks. They look and speak like fashion models instead of journalists. They draw their paychecks from General Electric, Viacom, Disney, AOL Time Warner, and Rupert Murdoch. There is no appealing the calls that they make, day after day, night after night, even when there is a barnload of visible daylight between their interpretation of what happened and what actually happened. They hide behind their masks, and all the screaming and dirt kicking doesn't change a thing. Baseball is, of course, only a game. There is an annual celebration of shock, heartbreak, rage, and woe in Boston at the conclusion of every season. The lights go off at Fenway, the bags are packed, and the bats are put in storage. Red Sox Nation shrugs its shoulders and turns its collective focus to Foxborough, where another local team has recently learned to overcome the generational curse of assured failure. There is always some other team to turn to when Nomar and Manny and Pedro disembark for Point South until April. Life goes on. No one is dead. No one is broken. No one is sick. No true damage is done. This is not the case in George W. Bush's America. The season never ends here, and the dead bodies are piling up in grisly snowdrifts. They finally came out with an estimate of the number of Iraqi soldiers that were killed in this thing. 45,000. The lies are constant, and the ranks of the broken and abused are swelling inexorably towards some awful critical mass. That war in Iraq, treated like a sporting event with bullets instead of baseballs, has cost us over 300 troops at this point, I believe. Several thousand troops who have lost arms and legs and testicles and faces, who will never be the same. Thousands and thousands and thousands of civilians who are coming more are coming every day, shot down by nervous 19-year-olds who have no business being in the situation that they've been put in. The 3rd Infantry Division is not a police force. It's not nation building. A friend of mine who was in the military said once something that I will always remember, that the Army is good for two things, killing people and breaking stuff. Anything beyond that is above their pay grade. These kids have been left out to dry. What does any of this have to do with baseball? This is serious stuff. As serious as anything this nation has faced in its history. And one of the things that you deal with, or I've been dealing with, I'm sure you've been dealing with, is just this almost unbelievable sense of self-interest from people who are talking about this war. Don't care what goes on in Iraq. It's not my problem. It's 15,000 miles away, right? Well, here's what you can tell them. And this is the best part. This is probably my favorite part. They lied about the Iraq al-Qaeda connections with their bare faces hanging out and started a war that shredded Iraq to such a degree and brought such chaos that now it is becoming a hotbed for al-Qaeda activity. They created that which they were lying about. So when you are dealing with people whose own self-interest says Iraq is not my problem, you can tell them what red alert means. Red alert is martial law, the suspension of habeas corpus, the suspension of posse comitatus. That's what's going to happen if something else blows up over here. The governor of New Jersey was asked several months ago what red alert means to the average citizen. And he said, quote, "It means that you stay in your house. It means that if you go out on the street, you are considered an enemy combatant." Habeas corpus is the fundamental underpinning of our rule of law in this country. That was, by the way, originally redacted by John Ashcroft in the first draft of the Patriot Act. Robert Byrd put it back. Posse comitatus is the law that says that the cops are civilians and not soldiers. Very different rules of engagement. This war has been the greatest recruiting poster for Al-Qaeda ever. And we are facing a situation where we have put ourselves in much more danger. So if you want to get in people's faces and into their own self-interest and explain to them why this is important to them, you can explain to them what red alert means. Back to baseball. What does this have to do with it? With all of this happening and with no easy way to reverse or blunt this course, wouldn't it be easier to just give up? Where do I get off making trite sports analogies in this situation? I do it because it's instructive when considering the next step. The issue here is a simple matter of hope. People of good conscience cannot surrender the struggle against the rising tide with all that is at stake. At the end of the day, the point is simple. Even if it is a losing fight, which I don't believe it is, it wouldn't be any kind of a fight at all if we didn't show up to fight it. You have to capture the mentality. You have to capture the mentality of the Red Sox fan, as I have. You start every season almost completely sure that you will be beaten soundly. You lick your wounds and dust yourself off and maybe cry a little bit into your pillow. But you always think to yourself, even after the Bucky Dents and the Bill Buckners and the Yankees outspending you and the umpires not doing their jobs, you always think, this could be it. This could be the year. You do it because you want to be there at the turning of the tide. The Boston Red Sox have not won a championship in 85 years, and there is no sign that they are coming close this year or anytime soon. Yet the stands in Fenway Park are filled night after night to capacity. The crowd cheers and hoots and prays and comes back again and again. In its own small way, this is the very definition of hope. When that day dawns, when some October night, in a time to come, absorbs the victory roar of people who have watched great-grandfathers and grandfathers and fathers live their entire lives and die unfulfilled, when the Red Sox finally do win the World Series, it will have been worth every minute of pain and suffering. One of my favorite sports memories is when the New York Rangers won the Stanley Cup after like 40 years. There was this incredibly old guy up in the nosebleed seats after they were bringing the cup out who stood up with a banner that said, "Now I can die in peace." That's just baseball. This is America. At bottom, America is an idea. You can have all of our roads, our crops, our people, our cities, our armies. You can take all of that away. And the idea, however unfulfilled it has been, will still be there, as pure and great as anything conceived by the human mind. I am one of these fools who thinks that the idea that is America is one of the last best hopes for humankind. When used properly, it can work wonders. The idea itself is in mortal peril. You can keep all the roads, all the cities, all the crops, all the people, all the armies. You can keep all of that. But if you murder the idea, you have murdered America itself in a way that 10,000 September 11ths could never do. And the men and women within this current administration are murdering the idea that is America with their lies, with their Patriot Acts, with their making you afraid, with their destruction of civil liberties, their daily undermining of even the most basic tenets of decency and freedom and justice that we have tried to live up to for the last 227 years. One of the worst things that has ever happened in this country was when these people became able in public to use words like freedom, justice, democracy, patriotism, for those good and noble words became the foulest of lies when passing their lips. That, and that alone, should be enough to get you on your feet with your fist in the air or out in the street come tomorrow and Saturday, whether or not you believe we have a chance of success. We may not win, but we have to fight them. If we don't, we are the traitors that some would say we are. When all else fails, I fall back on the words of the extraordinary anti-war activist Daniel Berrigan. A friend of Berrigan's, a man named Mitchell Snyder, was for years an advocate and activist for the homeless in Washington, D.C. Snyder became despondent over the fact that his government could spend billions on bombs and guns, but couldn't seem to find the money to help the homeless. He became so despondent that he committed suicide. Daniel Berrigan penned these lines in memory of Snyder, and it is in these lines that I find my own courage and hope when the darkness creeps too close. Some stood up once and sat down. Some walked a mile and walked away. Some stood up twice and sat down. I've had it, they said. Some walked 2 miles, then walked away. It's too much, they cried. Some stood and stood and stood. They were taken for fools. They were taken for being taken in. Some walked and walked and walked. They walked the earth, they walked the waters, they walked the air. Why do you stand, they were asked, and why do you walk? Because of the children, they said, and because of the heart, and because of the bread. Because the cause is the heart's beat, and the children born, and the risen bread. The cause is the heart's beat. This cause is my heart's beat. It's yours. May it be there for all time until the day comes when we can once again stand in awe and pride before our flag and our government and our nation, when we can revel in that rescue dream that is America. Until then, we are at the barricades and on the streets and in the faces of all of those who would spend our precious blood on lies and profit and greed. They can take nothing from us that we are not willing to give. And we are not willing to give this great nation up. Let them be warned. We stand our ground. Thank you. I'm not 100% sure the numbers of the effects upon the Iraqi people. I know that something like 1.5 million of them have died from a variety of things, from the sanctions to the war, to probably the fact that because of all the depleted uranium, Baghdad is one of the hottest places on earth. I do know that the Vietnam War caused a disability rate among our soldiers of 9%. The Gulf War caused a disability rate of our soldiers of 26%. That is the depleted uranium, that is the vaccines that they were shot with, that is the oil smoke, and a variety of other factors. 26%.
They were only there for a week or so.
They were there for a day, yeah, if you believe what you hear. I don't think that, there are already some creepy cases popping up, some weird pneumonias and other such things, which is the great part about being in George Bush's America if you're a soldier. They just cut $12 billion from veterans benefits, and when you get back from the war, it takes 6 months to see a vet doctor. 6 months. There's an article popping up on Truth Out tomorrow called Depleted Uranium, What Support the Troops Really Means. I suggest that you seek it out and read it because it's footnoted to the heavens about what's going on with this particular situation. So, yes. We're working to find out. You're absolutely right. I was talking earlier today about reading Howard Zinn, reading Noam Chomsky. You know, one of the most important days of my life was when I actually sat down and read the People's History of the United States. I was depressed for about a year after that. And I had to come to exactly what we were talking about today, come to a certain understanding with myself. I wasn't around when slavery happened. I wasn't around when World War II happened. I was a twinkle in my mother's eye for Vietnam. I was young and dumb for the Gulf War. And I know good and well that the ideas that I'm talking about have never been lived up to. But this thing is happening on my watch. And there are 100 different ways personally for me to approach how to reach people and make them understand just how messed up all of this is. And though we have never lived up to the idea itself has merit and should be raised because it is still reachable. And you're right. If we were to stop doing what we were doing, our quote-unquote standard of living would be substantively different. In other words, we'd have to probably live the way 40, 50, 60% of the country and most of the rest of the world lives. And perhaps right now, the American people aren't willing to do that. They don't know any better. Garbage in, garbage out. But I talk about the idea as a way to bring people towards a higher understanding of what our responsibilities are. It's the difference between what America is and what America should be. And I go to bed all right every night raising that idea because I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to figure out a way to move us incrementally closer to that. And the fact that we've never lived up to it in the past and the fact that we may never live up to it in the future, the idea itself deserves the effort. I think that one of the most important things that we need to recognize as activists is that Republicans are not the enemy. Conservatives are not the enemy. These guys in Washington are not Republicans and not conservatives. They are something else. They are something different and far, far, far more dangerous. The definition of fascism, as defined by Benito Mussolini, who invented it in a barn in the 20s, fascism is the combination of state and corporate power. It is not the Nazis, it is not the gas chambers, although that was certainly part of one interpretation of it. We have this really kind of happy, narcissistic, benign fascism going on right now, so invisible to so many people that they don't even quite know what it is that they're looking at when they look at it. But I think from my own perspective and from traveling around to Arizona and Montana and Colorado, these hotbeds of republicanism, I always get people coming up to me being like, I just listened to your talk. I'm a Republican. I can't believe this is going on. A bunch of the guys in Veterans for Peace are super conservatives, but they are not buying what these guys are selling. And the problems that Mr. Powell and the FCC are enduring right now is happening for simply one reason, and one reason only, because conservatives and liberals have gotten together to kick some ass. I guess, well, we can squeak one in really quickly and then we've got to get rolling here.
You touched on a lot of things, Thank you.
The way that you would bring bipartisan connection on that one would be to get conservatives and Republicans to agree that something is in fact wrong, okay? And that is in large part what it is that we have to deal with. I think there's no question that, I mean, for my money in this whole thing, we can talk about the details of this stuff all day long. You know, there's all sorts of things that we could talk about. I've written 3 books in a year merely because there's so much to talk about. But at the end of the day, I think the single most important thing that we have to focus on for the children and for everybody else is the need in this country for all of us and for everyone else that is out there to overcome being afraid. That's it. That's everything. That's all of it. These guys are getting away with this stuff by terrifying the American people. That's how they do this. And if we can overcome our own fear to speak out, to get on the street. If we can convince other people to do that, and it was part of what he was talking about when he introduced me, do something that buys you the right to look at yourself when you come home. If you wear a Bush socks button out on the street and 50 people see you do that, who would feel the same way that you do but are too afraid to make that kind of a statement, however small, themselves, you have worked wonders. Your courage emboldens other people, and emboldening other people is part of the game here. It's one of the things that I'm going to talk about on Saturday at the rally, is to stop being afraid. And the last, just one thing occurred to me thinking about the gentleman's question before, because it's the ultimate question for me, is that it was 40 years ago that Martin Luther, just right 40 years ago, very recently, that Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech. He was speaking about ideals that I'm speaking about, and America was the same kind of country it was then that it is now. Those are still good words, and they're still good ideals to live up to. And to a certain extent, I don't care how disaffected, disillusioned, and disgusted you are with this country, how it has always been, and how it may always be. The point of the exercise is to spend your life trying to change that. And that's it. That's the best that you can do. So thank you very much for having me here.